This week on the Capital Cable, what's happening in Japan? New prime minister, implications for the alliance, trilateral relationship, all that and more. Some of the best in the business to walk us through all of these issues. Next on the Capital Cable. All right, good morning to those of you in DC. Good evening to those of you in Korea and Japan for this episode as well. And good day to those of you around the world. Welcome to the 99th installment of the CSIS Capital Cable. I'm Mark Lippert, your host and moderator. This week on the Capital Cable, what's happening in Japan? New prime minister, implications for the alliance, implications in East Asia, implications for the world. With us, a terrific, top-notch, meticulously assembled panel to walk us through really complicated and extraordinary bucket of issues. And we are fortunate to have them here on the Capital Cable. And let me introduce them properly. I will give their truncated bios because they are so, I would say, their regular bios are so full of accolades that it would take the entire broadcast. So let's go through them quickly. Sheila Smith, of course, a seasoned hand of the Capital Cable, a senior fellow for Asia Pacific Studies at the Council of Foreign Relations, well known for her tenure and work there. East-West Center experience, university in Japan, Keio, Japan, two leading security-focused Japanese think tanks, adjunct professor at Georgetown, author of one of my favorite books, Japan Rearmed. I think it was a 2019 publication. Check that out. And her doctorate and master's from Columbia University. Sheila, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Mark. Happy to be here.
All right, outstanding. Next up, Yuki Tatsumi, co-director of the Japan program at Stimson. She, of course, is a CSIS veteran as well. Time at the Embassy of Japan, master's degree in CSIS, well published. Look up online. It's an outstanding catalog of works. Welcome back to the show, Yuki. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Here we go again. Thanks, Mark. Great to be here, as always.
Fantastic. Usually I mute Victor, so we want you off mute. All right, and of course a new addition to the CSIS lineup, Nicholas Szechenyi, senior fellow Japan chair, former Fuji TV producer, interesting in and around Japan for a long time. Really knows Japan well, of course. Hopkins, CSIS, graduate degree, Connecticut College. Nicholas, welcome. I think this is your first Capital Cable, especially in your new role. Welcome to the show.
It is. Thank you very much. Pleasure.
All right, outstanding. And one of our regulars, of course, Katrin Katz, well known to our loyal, faithful, intrepid viewers. CSIS, of course, adjunct fellow, political science professor of practice at the University of Miami, a Korea Society fellow as well, and former, of course, NSC, where she served in government with great distinction. PhD from Northwestern, undergraduate from University of Pennsylvania. And Katrin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Mark. Glad to be here.
All right, outstanding. We made it through the intros. We're going to get into a deadly serious topic, but before we do that, we just have a disclaimer in that I think Katrin's husband's working out in the other room. We've got a snoring corgi over in Sheila's neck of the woods. So this is going to be a sporty, in addition to an informative edition of the Capital Cable. So with that, let's get into a deadly serious topic. Really interesting stuff out of Japan. Sheila, over to you. Just can you give us the basic laydown of what's happening on the domestic scene there in Japan, and obviously take it any direction you want. And again, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and with the shadow of Victor hanging over us, it's a delight. So all of us Japan politics nerds have had a wonderful month or so watching what's going on in the Liberal Democratic Party. For those of you who are not Japan nerds, it's important to understand that the LDP has been in power either in majority or in coalition for most of the post-war period. If you know a Japanese Diet member, Probably they're from the LDP. So these are the Japanese conservatives, but they're also the governing party, the ruling party in coalition at the moment. So the sitting prime minister, Kishida, decided mid-August to make our late summer vacations not happy and step out of the race. He was up for his tenure race within the party for the party presidency. Surprise, surprise, he decided that the party needed a fresh face. It's faced a lot of political fundraising issues, and the public was getting a little bit fed up with them. They do that periodically for the LDP, and he wanted a fresh face and said, I'm out. So what happened was 9 people decided to jump in, many of them very familiar to folks around here in Washington. 5 of them went to graduate school or undergraduate school in the United States. So this is a crowd that's well known abroad, roughly speaking. So 9 candidates total, 2-week campaign, lots of boring debates, honestly, and some really interesting televised debates. And in those televised debates, we can get into this later, some interesting stuff on the military security diplomatic side of Japanese policy. Ishiba Shigeru, the man that won at the end of the day, started early. I was surprised, honestly. He said, this is my 5th try and my last. He is incredibly popular at the grassroots of the LDP, so he has a lot of support around the regions. He himself comes from an agricultural region, so he's got a lot of nostalgia in his campaign style, but also a very strong push for regional revitalization, something I think that has a lot of resonance in Japan, because a lot of the changes we saw under Abenomics were mostly affecting urban Japanese, right? So Ishiba dresses up in all kinds of costumes and does all kinds of funky stuff that plays really well out in the regions. Koizumi Shinjiro, was also out there fast, because everybody loves Koizumi, young Koizumi, handsome, dynamic, charismatic. But he fell back during the race. The person who fell up during the race is Takaichi Sanae. And just to remind you, she was also a candidate in the election that brought Prime Minister Kishida to power. She did remarkably well. She represents a very conservative, socially conservative side of the party, but also is very hawkish and is very forward-leaning on that. So at the end of the day, there's a 2-phase, I won't get into all the mechanics of it, but there were 2 phases to the race inside the LDP. The first represents a larger voice of the grassroots. The second phase represents more of the Diet members, so the parliamentarians. And where Ishiba's strength is weak, Takaichi's is stronger. But at the end of the day, you saw some interesting coalition formation by 3 former prime ministers, former Prime Minister Suga, former Prime Minister Aso, and of course, at the very last minute, Kishida had to make his choice on who he's going to support. So the last 2 candidates standing in the first round was Ishiba and Takaichi. Koizumi dropped out. And Takaichi actually won, the first round. And then they went to the second round, and you see Kishida and Suga, reformers mostly, more dovish, if you like that terminology, swinging to the side of Ishiba Shigeru. I think that was largely because they were worried about the direction that Takaichi might take the party and the country should she become prime minister. So it's an interesting time to be looking at the dynamics inside the LDP. And of course, Ishiba became prime minister on October 1 and immediately called for a snap election on October 27. So I'll stop there, Mark, because that's a lot of detail. But we are now poised to go into a general election in Japan at the end of this month, but with a very divided and somewhat openly antagonistic 2 factions or 2 sets of folks within the LDP.
Fantastic stuff there, Sheila. Just if you could, one quick follow-up, and I'm going to ask Yuki and Nicholas the same questions, just quick on the implications for the alliance, right? You see early call between the new prime minister and President Biden. You see lots of press around defense issues, lots of churn and stir there. Your take on that?
Well, I think that for the immediate next 1 month, it's all about the general election. So what survives after the general election is when we should get pretty serious about, what this means for the alliance. But Ishiba has some pretty interesting ideas. First, and he campaigned on these during the LDP election. First, he wants to revise the status of forces agreement. Any of you who know about our allies, either in Asia or other places, you know that the Status of Forces Agreement is attached to a security treaty, and it really governs the management of our U.S. military forces in that country. They're all different, by the way. There's an outline that's fairly similar, but the specifics are negotiated by each host government. So he wants to make it more equal. In other words, he wants to get rid of some of the aspects of extraterritoriality that the Americans have on Japanese soil. We can talk about why if you'd like later. The second thing he got a lot of coverage for this idea, and that is he wants an Asian NATO. And that's the language he uses when you see him in debate talking about what he means by that. He basically implies that collective self-defense, which is what the Japanese constitutional interpretation allows the Japanese military to do, which is to protect Americans if they're in a fight with Japanese for the sake of Japan's security. But he really wants collective security, which implies reciprocity, which implies, an Asian NATO obviously implies more than just the United States, but other like-minded partners in Asia. But the emphasis when he talked during the debate was really on it's time for collective security. Japan will need it to deter the world that we're now facing.
All right, outstanding, Sheila. You brought flashbacks back to my old job as Assistant Secretary of Defense, the SOFA. Collective, yes. Anyway, all of that. All right, Yuki, over to you. Same questions, please. Broad strokes on the domestic political machinations, number one, and implications for the alliance. And Yuki, again, welcome back to the show.
Again, thanks again, Mark, for having me. It is great. It's a hard act to follow after Sheila. This is so unfair. But anyway, I'll give my own take. I generally agree with what Sheila has just laid out. So I'm going to looking at the perhaps the upcoming general election in October 27th and beyond. There are a couple of things to think about for especially more exclusively, not necessarily, but they're more specifically for us Japanese domestic politics nerds, but then more broadly because it does have an implication, especially given the much global nature of the U.S.-Japan alliance has. So I think one thing that I thought was striking was after all the coalescing, and then especially I would always describe the between the first round and second round that Sheila explained, that in between break, which is probably maximum 15 minutes, is probably the most interesting domestic political jockeying moments. That one of those that if you have an eyes and ear to the wall, you want to be those eyes and ears, because this is where mostly the horse trading happens in terms of, okay, I give you my diet members, followers votes. If you can give X number of cabinet position to the guys that follows me, all those negotiations happen practically between those 15 minutes. So one thing to think about is all these people, especially even though, like Sheila said, there were 9 candidates, by the time that voting came, it was already narrowed down to who the top 3 is going to be. And then it's kind of, depending on, basically the question was, amongst those top 3 candidates, which 2 will go to the runoff? And this is where Takaichi really defied the expectation, because everybody leading up to the first round of voting was, of course, Koizumi is going to win the first round. And then Ishiba is going to be the close second. So it will be interesting who Takaichi decides to support in the second round. First round happened, surprise, surprise. Ishiba's strength was always said to be the popular votes, but Takaichi ended up getting more votes in that category. So she came atop of Ishiba. So that's where basically all this conventional calculation that all the spectators were having kind of went out of the window. So we kind of went into this unknown territory. And now I would say that practically no one that I know of in Japan had expected that the Ishiba came on top. Ishiba would emerge. So this is what I think is, especially because of some of the very interesting policy ideas that he laid out on certain another institutions in Washington D.C.'s website as he was elected to the LDP president. This was kind of for a lot of the people who within Japan watches closely how the Japan security policies formed and developed, this is kind of like the Brexit moment. Basically, oh my gosh, we didn't think he would win. Now what? We know about all his interesting ideas all these 2 decades. He's going to try to implement those. And what do we do about this? Because this is not at this particular point in time when he first introduced those ideas, revision of SOFA, Asia, NATO. It was considered still interesting, but then more of an innovative, fresh kind of, okay, out of box thinking. Someone needs to push that, thinking box for Japanese security policy trajectory. But Japan is at the very different place today than the time when Ishiba first formed those ideas. And what's key here for us to watch Ishiba is whether his thinking will evolve should he survive this general election. Because I would describe his strategic views outlook as frozen in time. Because that was the last time when he was still first supported to advocate SOFA, first, revision, first started to advocate Asia NATO idea. That was the last time he was at the very much closer center to the power and influence. And then Mr. Abe came in, and his faction and his grouping were largely the political outliers within the LDP party politics. So this is kind of like, who has been not the mainstream of the party and a strategic trajectory that has been set by the party leadership for the last 2 decades, all of a sudden came back with vengeance. So of course they're going to try to achieve the dream that they were not able to achieve when they were powerful. But the reality is, in this past 2 decades, strategic environments around Japan changed drastically. Nature of the U.S.-Japan alliance changed drastically. And so is Japan's security partnership and other partnership around the region and around the globe changed drastically. So how quickly he can catch up with that reality, I think is going to be a key should he survive October 27th election, which, by the way, in my book, that is still a very open-ended question.
All right, outstanding, really interesting stuff. Let me come to Nicholas then, and Nicholas, two questions. One, first, anything to add on these 2 questions that I posed to both Sheila and Yuki? Obviously, take it that way. Perhaps just if you could tease out a little bit some of these other issues that have emerged here. First, one, you've got these very interesting new ideas on the security relationship. At the same time, you've got a U.S. election, right? You've got 2 parts of the alliance here, right? So that's one I would be interested. 2, these are my sub-bullets. The second sub-bullet is the different factions, right, that have been described in the previous interventions. How does that play out, both in terms of the election and the alliance? And then I guess I have to make a comment here, and anybody welcome as you may go through the round. We've seen a little bit of this before, right, in terms of when the DPJ came to power and the Futenma issue and the alliance. And I'm not saying it's apples to apples, but I'm just saying that there have been, I guess you would say, ripples or, potential movement in and around the establishment, sort of the status quo, rather, of alliance structures and machinations, right? That's not a very artful way to say it, but it's there's some eerie echoes, I guess I'd put it that way. So, Nicholas, the floor is yours. I threw a lot at you. Take it any direction. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. Let me just add a few points and let Katrin get in the mix. I think the other point to emphasize in the context of the LDP election is that the LDP was really stung by a fundraising scandal. A kickback scandal, which was very embarrassing. Kishida really couldn't recover from it, and that was a contributing factor, I think, to his decision to step down. And so you could argue that when the top 3 were contending for the premiership, that one factor was, well, who's going to help us change our image domestically going forward? And they chose Ishiba, who's talked about reform, who's talked about transparency in the policymaking process. So that I thought was very interesting. But pair that, though, with initial public opinion polls, which just came out yesterday, showing that his approval rating is around 50%, which is pretty lukewarm. And so he's got his work cut out for him domestically. So I think it is very intriguing and important to talk about the implications for Japanese foreign policy and U.S.-Japan relations. But as Sheila and Yuki have pointed out, this is a huge hurdle to clear in terms of domestic politics. And so I think it's probably an uphill climb in the next several weeks, centered mainly on economic policy, but happy to talk more about that if people are interested. On the implications for the alliance, I agree. He's introduced some unique ideas, so to speak. But in his press conference the other day, what did he do? He reiterated the central themes that were articulated by Abe and carried forward by Kishida, which were strengthening Japan's defense capabilities, the U.S.-Japan alliance, and networking with other like-minded partners. And his defense minister, Nakatani, his foreign minister, Iwaya, both veterans in U.S.-Japan affairs, have already kind of put some cold water on the Asian NATO idea. So that's interesting. Like maybe we're going to see a movement away from the rhetoric he was articulating in favor of a very clear, pragmatic trajectory strategically for Japan, which successive U.S. administrations have embraced. And I think that would be the next point. You asked about the U.S. election. The Trump administration embraced Abe's strategy on defense. You know, fundamentally, Japan was standing up to China, and I think that animated the way Trump looked at Japan. And the Trump administration embraced the free and open Indo-Pacific framework, which was Abe's regional strategy. They embraced the Quad, which, of course, the Biden administration elevated to a leadership level. But nonetheless, you had a lot of synergy during the Trump administration, and that was carried forward in even more dynamic ways during Biden. So for a new Japanese prime minister to look at this trajectory and suddenly come to Washington and talk about other ideas, I think would be a little strange tactically. I'm sure these issues will come up because Ishiba does have strong convictions, but I would be shocked if he rocked the boat and tried to suddenly change the tenor of U.S.-Japan relations. And finally, you asked about factions. Yes, it is a factor. And I think going back to your reference to the DPJ period from 2009 to 2012, there was concern then because the opposition didn't have much governing experience, and that was difficult. The other factor was that in this period where you had turnover in Japanese administrations, Japan didn't have a strategic voice. It didn't have a consistent vision. That's different now. Abe did set a vision forward, and I'm fairly optimistic that there might be new themes and new ideas. But from my vantage point, Japan's strategic trajectory is set, and it would be foolish for a Japanese leader to suddenly depart from it. So that's my take.
All right, outstanding.
Mark, real
Yuki,
quickly,
come on in.
real quickly. So on that note, in my initial comment, I mentioned about the break between first round voting and second round voting. That is an interesting 15 minutes amongst those groups. And Ishiba, it does remember that had Kishida moved to support him, he wouldn't have won. And it would be kind of probable to imagine that in lieu of rendering his support, thereby his follower support for Ishiba for the second round, he could have asked for a certain level of commitment from Ishiba that, it's fine to try new ideas, but these are the core that you ought to keep. So that's something to kind of keep in mind moving forward.
All right, outstanding. Come back. Katrin, I'm going to come to you in just 1 second. You've been sitting on the sidelines way too long. Nicholas, one quick follow-up. You mentioned the economic policy. The only reason I wanted to bring it up quickly is because if you have a new president here that happens to be a former president in President Trump, the economic policy and the trade policy really rises up in terms of salience quickly, right? And helps define the contours of the relationship. Thoughts quickly on that bucket of issues going forward?
Yeah, sure. I think it's safe to say that Japan is preparing for a protectionist trade policy, a focus on home shoring and increasing manufacturing in the United States, and perhaps less appreciation for Japan's long history of foreign direct investment in the U.S. And its support for the U.S. economy as an ally and a partner. So certainly that's a challenge. But I think there are ways that you can steer that conversation in a positive direction. I don't think coming to Washington and talking about TPP or returning to multilateral trade agreements is going to work, although Japan will continue to carry that baton forward with Australia and other countries. But I think things like combating Chinese economic coercion, for example, would be a theme that either a Harris or Trump administration could carry forward. So the trade pillar is going to be the weakness in the alliance. There's no doubt about that, and that's the fault of the United States. But Japan is very adept at thinking creatively about how to generate positive momentum. So we'll see how that evolves.
All right, outstanding. Katrin, over to you. But before I come to you, one quick comment. I've always been curious as to why a creative solution doesn't involve the USMCA construct, right? That's a Trumpian construct that has bipartisan support. You had labor coming to the table. I've always felt that's just my soapbox intervention here. So I'm going to stop there. Katrin, you've been on the sidelines way too long. Comments on the general interventions, obviously welcome. Also would love to bring in your expertise on the Korea side, what Seoul is thinking, implications for the trilateral relationship that I'd say, over the last 10 to 15 years, all three sides have worked so hard to make progress on. Katrin, the floor is yours. And again, apologies for the tardiness in getting to you.
No apologies. I love listening. I love the sidelines. I learn a lot. There's so much in play, and the prior speakers have laid out a lot that impressively, especially getting into the details of the election itself. My goodness, both Sheila and Yuki, you really unpacked that in a way that was masterful. And Nicholas, bringing in elements of the U.S. election as well and other key issues in play. For what it's worth, because these are like star Japan watchers here, just kind of wanted to lay out how I saw it, how I've been kind of unpacking the news in recent days. And that is, I guess, this maverick quality of Ishiba, what made him such a surprise. In many ways, it's kind of a superpower in terms of getting him elected. He's showed himself to be fearless in terms of standing alone, which can be a very powerful thing in politics, as we all know. He's been willing to criticize the LDP from the inside. So as Mark noted, the DPJ years, we've heard some of these lines, but to be criticizing LDP, big players like Abe from the inside really says something about his character. It did not win him friends internally in the LDP, but it won him respect at a time, among the general public, at a time when, as Nick noted, these major scandal and decrease in confidence in the LDP. So my reading of the election, and again, it came really close, was that, in coming to this more general election phase in a couple of weeks, the public vote is going to be really important. So that got him, some support within the LDP that he didn't have in prior years. That said, this maverick quality also comes from these kind of quirky, I guess, for lack of a better term, comments that maybe are cut from another era, but consistent with this character, right? Kind of unpredictable, saying things that are a little out there, how to fit that into the mix of things. My take, I guess I'm kind of like thinking along the lines of Nick, like what I'm seeing the early signals that he might govern, in a way that he didn't necessarily as a critic from the outside of this top position. Of course, he's had a number of positions within the government, but not in top leadership. And he faces, as Yuki noted, this really, intense time period, intense threats right on the doorstep. And the question comes to mind, does he have the luxury of time, to kind of be a bull in a china shop with things that may not be optimal? They might be suboptimal from his perspective, but what will the cost of that be? We've all dealt with alliance management things, and when you get into SOFA and these acronyms, tends to suck the oxygen out of strategic moves. And he also wants to achieve things strategically. He also, very much wants to be able to deter China and also cooperate with China. So I would just question how he does that when one leg of the triangle, the US-Japan leg, might be uncertain at best and kind of maybe fractured at worst, which China and other rivals in the region would, I think, see as a weakness and try to broaden a kind of rift that it might see there. And likewise, in terms of Asian NATO, how would he leave open the door for cooperation with China, given that this is a closed regional arrangement? Kishida, Abe, this kind of lineage of free and open Indo-Pacific, it's an inclusive, it's values-based, it's behavior-based. And so in many ways, the beauty of it, the flexibility of it is we're not anti-China. Well, have a really hard time convincing China that Asian NATO is not an anti-China kind of framework. So it really trips himself up and his own objectives with respect to the greatest foreign policy challenge for Japan, which is China. And so I would just, wonder whether in the coming weeks, of course, it's going to be consumed by the election, but in the coming weeks, we do see a tempering down and a walking back of these types of positions. Like might be a face-saving way to do it. I noticed in the Hudson paper, he did say Asian NATO is a future thing, can be a future thing, one of the small lines in there. His foreign minister walked back that statement as well in the last couple of days. So we'll see, we'll see whether he is the maverick or the pragmatist that we haven't seen before, but might be needed for him to achieve his own stated aims.
All right, outstanding. That's great stuff. Well worth the wait, as always. Let me come back to Sheila. Sheila, I wanted to tease out two things that Katrin mentioned, and obviously any other thoughts you might have, but a tactical question that I want to ask your advice on. I'd be remiss, you're such a security expert on this SOFA idea, right? I'm thinking about the old kind of Pentagon hat I had. Ash Carter and I talked a lot about USFJ, its future. He was thinking along the lines of making it a truly operational command. But, you find that USFJ is really a strange animal, right? In the DoD zoo, for lack of better words, right? It's kind of the keeper of the SOFA, right? And if you go back and start rewriting the SOFA or reopening that, how do you square that circle with efforts to try to make it more strategic and operational, given that you have limited time, energy, resources, bandwidth to deal with? That's the tactical. And then if you could pivot to the more strategic questions raised, China, Korea, what is all of that what's the future of that prognostication, for lack of a better term? Thanks. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Happy to do that. I just wanted to just say, what we're looking at in the short term, just to repeat, and Yuki made the same point, and I agree, is we're looking at an election, right? And he wants the public mandate, and this is where his superpower comes from, right? Is popular support and trust. Nikkei had an interesting flash opinion poll. Only 51% of the Japanese people are supporting the Ishiba cabinet, which is 20 points lower than Hatoyama, since we keep mentioning the DPJ, and about 15 points or so lower than when Kishida came in. So he's got a struggle here ahead of him. But the public,
Sheila, you're way too grounded. This is a show about wild speculation and
wild speculation. Okay, so I don't think he's going to be voted out of office, but we should get ready for the LDP to lose seats. That's what we should actually get ready for.
Despite my inclinations to go way down the road,
we're not going, yes. but many in Tokyo are already
it's a really good point.
Yeah,
it's a really good point.
They're going to coalition government with the CDPJ with Noda. Yes. I mean, they're way down the pike. I am not down the pike, but I think we should prepare ourselves for the fact that the LDP will have a lesser mandate than they've got already, and that makes parliamentarianism hard. You can't legislate governance as easily as you can when you've got a nice grasp on the supermajority. So that's what we're looking at. On Ishiba's thinking, I may have a slightly different take than Yuki on that Hudson article, and I will say it's Hudson because people might want to go read it, and they should actually go read it in English. What you get in there is both Ishiba's old ideas and long-term thinking about SOFA revision and the Asian NATO. that's been around. He's been thinking about these things for a long time. But what you get is a preface that says Japan has no time to mess around. And he starts off with Ukraine and the lack of collective security functioning for Ukraine. He starts off with the dysfunction of the UN Security Council, which is where we always start with Japan, but he starts there. And then he said they were not in NATO either. They were vulnerable. And that's where he starts off that essay. And I think it's really important to understand that he is digesting, not only thinking about his long-term thinking process, but he's also digesting the volatility out front. And that gets to your point about not only the region, but the world at large. I think it's also important that he was in Taiwan a week, 10 days just before the campaign started. He had a scheduled trip, but nonetheless, it got lots of attention, meeting with President Lai. Basically saying that Japan and Taiwan have close relations, always have affinity for each other, and that the cross-straits relations is very important for Japanese security. So he's on the record of saying Taiwan matters to Japanese security, and he said it publicly to the president of Taiwan. That's a continuity. I think when we look also during the campaign, and this has also came out in Ishiba and other candidates' commentary during the campaign on TV, the Russians had an air incursion up north, right? They came in 3 times, apparently, according to Hayashi, who was chief cabinet secretary, even though they're denying it. The Chinese have had incursions as well into Japanese waters. So you're seeing Russia and China really kind of put some pressure. And it's interesting, they did this during the presidency, the election for the LDP presidency. So they're drawing Japan out. You're also seeing coverage in the media now of disinformation campaign attributed to China in Okinawa, which is how I'm going to approach your SOFA question, Mark. Nobody understands the vulnerability, I think, of the politics in Okinawa for Japanese security better than Ishiba. And he was defense minister 2013, 2014, I'm sorry for the dates, but somewhere around there, when a US Marine helicopter fell on an Okinawan university. He was ticked off. I'm not sure what kind of language we're allowed to use on the cable, but he was angry as defense minister and openly in the press said, we need the Okinawan Prefectural Police to lead the investigation of the accident, whereas the Marine Corps was handling it, right? So he's very irritated at that. And he very quickly said, maybe we need to revise the SOFA. Maybe we need to change the way that we manage the US military presence. So there's a history of his experience with trying to manage the SOFA during a more a political crisis. But frankly, had there been students in session, that would have been a very big, luckily the university was closed and there weren't any fatalities or casualties or anything. It was just a helicopter came down, not just, but the helicopter had to crash land. So when you look at SOFA revision for Ishiba, it comes from a position of Japanese sovereignty, Japanese autonomy, and a bigger Japanese voice in how these things are handled. And I think a crucial worry of Ishiba's about the vulnerability of Okinawa. We have a huge presence there. It's needed more than ever in today's geopolitics, obviously, given the Southwestern Islands' proximity to Taiwan. It's not the time to allow this political vulnerability to fester. Now, I may be putting words in his mouth, but that's where I sense he's coming from. It's not a gratuitous SOFA revision, or it's not the political point that the DPJ was trying to make. This is something he's dealt with, and I think he cares about. And it also is very specific. It'll matter to everybody in Japan, but Okinawa specifically is now, I think, a target, the Chinese. And so we got to keep our eye on that ball. It may not be a bad thing quietly for our folks in the Pentagon to have a little exploratory conversation about maybe not full-on revision, but what could we do to make this a better outcome, especially vis-a-vis our base presence in Okinawa. Anyway, that's my little SOFA piece. I think the other is when it comes to South Korea, and I think Yuki and Nick are both absolutely right, that with Kishida's support, this puts the Trilateral in a much better position, right? And I think Kishida, one of the reasons I'm guessing that Kishida swung behind Ishiba is because Kishida himself had put so much effort into the bilateral Japan-Korea, restoration of trust, as Katrin pointed out. It's a critical piece of the architecture in the region. But also next year, 2025, is the 60th anniversary of the Japan ROK. normalization treaty agreement. It's going to be highly political. You know, it's not about the trilat. It's not about military cooperation. This is really about celebrating, if they can, the Japan-ROK political relationship, the post-war diplomatic relationship. And I think that's somewhere where Kishida is absolutely going to want to put an awful lot of attention, because it's so vital to Japanese security and it's so vital to the trilat. So that in and of itself, I think we shouldn't, you know, that's coming over the horizon, may not be appreciated by the Washington audience. Broader than that, I think his Asian NATO idea is theoretical rather than practical. And as Katrin pointed out, and Yuki did as well, I think, the new foreign minister very quickly said, oh, that's a long-term thing. And I think it's going to be really about, Ishiba is more worried about tabletop exercises in case of a Taiwan contingency. He mentioned this on the TV programs. We need to know what capabilities we have, what the United States would need, what other nations could bring. So he's got his mind very focused on the immediacy of the cross-straits scenario. And I'm not really worried about Asian NATO as something that's going to derail the alliance or make Washington and Tokyo feel like they're on a different path. I just don't think that's right. As we are all trying to grapple with institutional change, both at the UN, right, and in our Quad, in our renewed trilat emphasis, I think everybody is quietly thinking about how close to collective security can we get in Asia. Do we really want to continue with the hub and spokes? Is this the lattice work, I think is the most recent word we're using to describe it? Is this sufficient? Maybe when it comes down to the mill-mill relationships, that operational change and upgrade of U.S. Forces Japan and the Japanese Joint Operational Command that's coming next year, those are where the rubber meets the road. And Ishiba is is going to be very supportive of those kinds of initiatives. So I don't worry about that, but I do think we may have some homework on SOFA.
Interesting. Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, I would just say, the SOFA conversation, if you have it, does take a lot of bandwidth, right? It is a really, I would just say it sounds easy, right? And it is a very difficult, anyway, that's one. Two, I found,
Mark, I'm sorry, one footnote that's really important, and this is probably going to matter given the politics that we've all been talking about. It would have to go through the Japanese Diet. Right. If SOFA is revised. It would not have to go to our Congress because it's an executive agreement for the United States, but it would have to go through the Diet. Nobody in their right mind in the LDP is going to want to do that.
Right. And I would just say, and you start doing it in the US, you get heavy congressional scrutiny anyway, right? So it just gets it's a lot of bandwidth, right? And I think it just comes back to my point that I always make is, look, the most scarce resource in Washington is the time, energy, and attention of senior policymakers, right? And where do you want them to spend their time? Yeah. I think that's what gets interesting here. The other thing I'd say, what's also interesting is the takeaways that some of the different countries in the region have on the Ukraine situation, where North Koreans probably draw the lesson of nuclear weapons, where the Japanese see it more of an alliance issue, collective security. Yeah. Final point, what's interesting here is the tension between sovereignty and collective security, right? That's an interesting one as well that we could explore at another time. And I should get off the stage, Sheila, on your intervention and just say, Victor does support casual swearing on this show. I run a G show, but just FYI. All right, Yuki, I'm sorry, we're almost out of time. Could you just closing thoughts? Then we're going to go to Nicholas and Katrin. We'll go a little bit over, but just if you could just give us some final thoughts. Apologies, this was such a good conversation that we ran a little over, but Yuki, please. Mute.
Oh geez. Okay. One of these days I'll get it. Thank you for important addition. Those are really important things to think about. I think the one thing that I would say is one thing that Hudson Institute piece that I read, or we all will read at some point or the other. What's barking at missing is his mentioning of new domains. Cyberspace, that's completely not there. And that's what I think I do, I am hearing that that's what people in Tokyo who has been really involved in this transformation, really, really nervous. It's like, to what extent he actually understands the significance of these new domains in a way that it was not when he was around last time. So that was, I would just say that one thing. And then another thing is collective security. Yes, it is it may be the long time goal, and it is out of the box thinking, but what's crucial and on left is the legal status of self-defense forces. You cannot possibly go into these collective security arrangement when in all means of defense, self-defense force looks like a military, walks like a military, talks like a military, that legally they are not considered military institution in Japan. So unless Japan solves that nut, and then that's Japan's own to solve, collective security actually exposes those self-defense force personnel vulnerable. And also I would just, this is the one last thing I would say about SOFA. I completely agree with you, Mark. It takes so much of the bandwidth. And we are also at the point where with Japan signing all these RAA, reciprocal access agreement with Australia, England, other partner companies, Japan is now may have to start thinking about negotiating the SOFA with these countries on their own. So those issues kind of open so many cans of worms that I just don't think the government that has barely 50% approval rating when it was supposed to be that, topping the approval rating of all the tenure has the bandwidth to deal with, even if he really, really wants to.
Great points. Wish we had more time. Yeah, and you and Sheila really point out the different sides of the SOFA, right? You've got bandwidth issues. On the other hand, Sheila talking a lot about maybe some skillful surgical type of changes that might help a lot. Very interesting stuff. That's why they pay people tiny government salaries to make these decisions. All right, Nicholas, final word from you.
Thank you. I'm very interested in how the opposition will perform in the upcoming lower house election. Polls show that the opposition party, the leading opposition party, the CDP, barely clears double digits, but they just elected Noda Yoshihiko, former prime minister, as their leader, very serious strategic thinker. So along the lines of wild speculation, maybe they're going to give the LDP a run for their money.
All right, outstanding. Really, really good stuff there. And more to follow. We're going to have all you back, but outstanding. All right, Katrin, last word to you.
Okay, I'm just very relieved I didn't have weights crashing through the wall. We've got enough going on, and I'm just happy to be able to wrap up on a quiet, peaceful note. Just very quickly, I'd be remiss not to mention the South Korea-Japan piece. I think to Yoon's great relief, President Yoon's great relief, we see support for continuity, keeping up the momentum. There's a pretty nice solid base of public support for this momentum on both sides as well in South Korea and Japan, across, renewing shuttle diplomacy, with the Trilat being something that Ishiba supports, but also importantly, his stance over a long period of time on the very sensitive historical issues. I guess I couldn't think of a better profile going into this anniversary year next year, because he's gone so far as to say, not just let's work together, but let's consider South Korea's views on this, which I think is, in this piece, wind at Yoon's back. In this piece, Yoon is having a hard time domestically, low approval ratings for other reasons, but this is something that he could really use as a boost, in this bilateral space, which is of course essential to the trilateral U.S., Japan, South Korea. Thank you.
Outstanding. Gavel down on episode 99. Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, Yuki. Thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Katrin. We covered the waterfront. I mean, unbelievable. Domestic machinations in Japan, alliance, China, Ukraine, Russia, ROK, the economic piece, and the U.S. election, all in 45 minutes. A tour de force. And for this, we are grateful for our guests. We're going to have each and every one of you back. So thanks again for that. We'll see everybody in 2 weeks. And Doosan, my team, I'm so sorry. Doosan Nation, we're out this year, but Nenya next year. All right. See everybody. Bye-bye.
I, I, I think we're good.